I'm here with Melissa May. So delighted to have you here, Melissa. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Melissa May, APR. I always say APR. I am a member of Public Relations Society of America. My day job is to be the Director of Sponsorships and Branding Solutions for KLRN, which is the PBS station in San Antonio and South Central Texas. And I am a longtime public relations professional and practitioner, having worked in corporations, in nonprofit organizations, in agencies, and pretty much all over the place. I'm also a very active volunteer in public relations in the community.
Awesome. We're very excited to have you here. Why should people care about public relations today?
Well, it's more important now than it ever has been in the past, I truly believe. We are facing so many difficulties in terms of misinformation and disinformation, and public relations professionals are the very folks who can help sort out what is right and what is wrong and what people really should be paying attention to. There's so many different voices out there, and knowing who to trust and who to believe is more important now than ever.
Ooh, who to trust, who to believe. These are very interesting questions. How do you navigate that world of trust in your professional life?
You know what? That's a very big challenge. And I think all of us have learned in the past personally how we come to trust someone. And we need to apply that professionally as well. So I think that people prove themselves worthy of trust, and they build up a reputation. And that reputation is what public relations is all about. So you know who to go to, what sources of media to go to, what humans to go to ask questions of. I was telling a friend of mine the other day that I went to vote, and there was someone on the ballot who I didn't know. And so I called a friend of mine who was very involved politically and said, "Do you know this person? Is this someone who I should vote for?" Because that person has a reputation, and I trust them on that issue. Public relations for organizations have the responsibility of building up trust for their organizations, so people know what to go to them for, what questions to ask them, and they know who to rely on.
What kind of questions are those? What are those important questions that drive the PR side of these important organizations?
That's actually a really good question, because I think public relations starts with listening. And so people are asking us questions, and we need to ask them questions. So, for example, I was on a webinar yesterday with some PBS folks from St. Louis, and they talked about their listening function and how they basically put their ear down in their community, and they find out what their community worries about, what concerns their communities. What came out of their discussion, their listening sessions, was a mental health program, a mental well-being program. In fact, that's one of the things that they learned, is that the term mental health wasn't the right term. The right term, from talking to experts, is mental well-being. And so this listening function, I think, is one of the most important in the public relations profession. We have to listen to our community. We have to listen not only to our customers and our clients, we have to listen to the whole community and understand what steps we should be taking as an organization.
Listening, that is such an important thing. Can you give us some more insights on how we can do that better? Are there any kinds of tips from a public relations perspective that could serve us in the listening front?
Yes, lots of them. In fact, I'm going to be giving a talk on next Saturday about RPIE. Do you teach RPIE?
No, tell us about that.
Yes. So communication strategy, PR professionals and communicators love their models. And one of our models in communication is RPIE. And there are other models like RACE and ROSIE and a number of them, but RPIE stands for research, planning, implementation, and evaluation. And in that research phase, these are the fundamental steps of strategic planning for a communications program or communications campaign. So in that research phase, which is so important and is often given slightly short shrift, is a great deal of listening, or needs to be a great deal of listening. So academicians might call this conducting secondary research or conducting primary research, and doing things like surveys and having focus groups come in. And in our organization, we have a community advisory board, and we have other boards, and most organizations do. And they need to be listening to these community boards who give them feedback and tell them what concerns people have. Media, watching media, traditional media as well as social media, and listening and seeing what is being said is also a great source of guidance to help develop the kinds of programs that lead to the kinds of communication that will help reach the needs of your constituents. So yeah, listening it's a big deal in PR.
Awesome. So it starts with this kind of listening research where we're doing deep listening to the media, we're doing deep listening to social media accounts, into the comments and engagement with those accounts. Are there any other sources of research in this listening mix that you would deem as extra important for a PR campaign or PR efforts?
Well, we do a lot of surveys. A lot of PR folks do surveys, and I mentioned focus groups. That's a kind of survey, but the old traditional surveys, or even new kinds of newfangled survey technologies, have really allowed us to keep our fingers on the pulse of our constituents and reaching out to them and finding out what they think about our existing programs. Say, for example, you implement a campaign, and one of the things that you need to do is continue to listen and to continue to research throughout that campaign, so you can find out if your message is penetrating, and if there's something that you can do to change either the message itself, or your channels, or your messenger, or one of the elements of your communication to have more of an impact. And so that listening should really actually take place, not just in the research phase, but also in the planning phase, in the implementation phase, and of course, finally in that evaluation phase, because that is where you're determining whether or not you have made an impact with your campaign.
I love how you went back to the model too. Can you give us some other models that are useful for PR professionals that you find people going back to again and again?
There is a 10-step model that PRSA advocates, and it's a little bit more complicated with determining in the planning stage, in the research phase, what will you do? In the planning stage, you have to determine what your messages are. The most fundamental thing is to find out who your audiences are, or your publics are, which you do in the planning stage, not to be a nerd here. You determine who your constituents are, who your publics are. And then when you're planning, you just determine really what are the goals that you're trying to achieve. What is the purpose of your communication? And who are you trying to reach? What are those audiences you're trying to reach in order to reach that goal? And then what are the messages that you're going to use to reach those folks? Who are the messengers who are going to communicate that message? And through what channels will you deliver those messages? And so if you're trying to reach someone who's, say you're trying to convey a Medicare message, you may not use TikTok for that, because that's not the folks who are paying attention to Medicare are probably not on TikTok. So it's pretty fundamental stuff like that. But in when I'm doing communication planning, I actually map out a huge array of all of the channels that are available to me. And then I also use, here's another model, the PESO model. So when I was younger, we tended to focus on paid media, earned media, and owned media. And now, thanks to Ginny Dietrich and Spin Sucks and some other folks who use the PESO model, we have added to that shared media. So shared is essentially social media, but you're asking people to share your communication. So if I send someone an email and I ask them to forward it along to someone else in their circles of influence, that is also a shared media. So the PESO model is a great way of thinking about and starting in your planning phases to write out all of the channels of communications that you can reach out to. And so a lot of those are yours. So they're your own database, they're your own email lists, they're your own newsletter database. They're, in our case, of course, we have television, we have PBS, and we have KLRN channels, officially channels that we can use to reach out to our constituents and to the constituents of our clients. So that's really important, is to write out all of those channels that you have access to, and then to think about what kind of messages might be conveyed most appropriately using those channels. So that's another model that we do love to use in the PR world.
Do you have any other models or frameworks that might help people as they try to wrap their head around these different components that you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, I do this when I do strategic planning with folks. One of the most important things that I talk about is ethics and values, and I'm reminded of this all the time, especially in this very divisive world or this very divisive nation, I should say, that we're living in right now. That these issues of values continue to come up over and over again. So I ask people to look at their organization's values and determine what are the most important values to the organization. So you can go online and just kind of Google in list of values, and you will see lists of hundreds of values. And so I will put those up on the screen as a framework and ask people to look at those and say, okay, which values are most important to you personally? And which values are most important to this organization? And this could be a board retreat for maybe a nonprofit that you're working on, or it could be the company or the organization that you work for. And so you do this as a team, and you just determine which are the values that are most closely related to your organizations. And I try to winnow it down. I start with 10 because it's hard to winnow it down. And then I try to get to 5 and say, these are the core values for our organization. Some people have already done this practice, but it's a good practice. And it's good to do every, year or so. And then I try to look at, or encourage folks to look at the organization's constituents and say, who shares our values? Or if you're looking for new publics, what groups of people share the same values that we do? And then in messaging, developing messaging for those folks, I encourage them to weave that value equation, that value connection in with the messages to say, hey, we share this, we have this in common. And that's a great way to message. And then again, keep listening, keep hearing if that message is resonating, and tweak it, adjust it, and continue to look for more publics as you do that.
So this connection between the components of values and getting those to line up with publics, that sounds straightforward. That sounds like, oh, I'm just going to look at my research data, I'm going to look at my survey data, I'm going to look at this stuff and say, okay, where do my values match up? But I know there's more to it. What kind of scaffolding belongs around that process?
Can I also just mention one other point? Values propositions can be very, very complicated. So one of the examples that I thought of as I was thinking about talking to you today is that when I talk to folks about values, and I don't want to say maybe 90% of the time when I've done this, the one value that always seems to shine through is family values. Family. My family is important to me. It's the most important thing to me. It's more important than, my coworkers. It's more important than anything. So a lot of organizations will try to tie into family values. So I was thinking about this last night, and I was thinking about the fact that organizations who are supporting completely different causes or different sides of a cause will tap into family values to make their points. And I was thinking of this, not to get controversial, but I love to. So I was thinking of this on the issue of gun rights. So folks who say, I am supportive of, kind of common sense gun rules or gun laws, will say, I want to do this because I want to protect my family. I'm doing this for the safety of my family. So do people who want to have more access to guns. They'll say, I want to keep my family safe. Safe from guns or safe with guns. So it's really an interesting phenomenon that we could talk about for hours and hours. This issue of ethics and this issue of values. So, I don't know that there is a cut and dry scaffolding that I can suggest for you, except that this is part of strategic planning. It's part of messaging. It's part of this determination of who your proper audiences are. I see folks, we're all on the internet all the time. I get a lot of messages from the Sandy Hook families, and they have very wisely found ways to message to appeal to both sides of this audience or of this issue. And I also know that the folks like in the National Rifle Association have done a very, very effective job of messaging their perspectives. And in fact, I've actually taught, when I was an educator, I've actually taught the communications of the NRA because they are such an effective organization. So that's one thing that you can think about, Ryan, is benchmarking organizations that you have found to be very, very effective and stealing tactics and stealing strategies from them.
And it's so great to have those concrete examples too. So you mentioned PIE, can you give us kind of a rundown of PIE versus races and how when might I use races? What are those things?
Okay, so and another school where I taught at Seton Hall University, they use the rope model, and honestly, it's all the same. It's all the same. It's just a term, and it's kind of a mnemonic device. It's a way to remember, to think about it, and keep it in your mind. So RACE is research, action, communication, and evaluation. Not so different. ROSIE is research, objectives, strategy, implementation, and evaluation. And ROPE is, if I didn't already say this, research, objectives, and planning and evaluation. So it's really just a way to go through a model and remind yourself how to truly strategically plan for your communications.
You have so much information and so much experience. How can the past help guide us and help us to think about the future of public relations?
And there's so much even loaded into the question about the past. So when I was teaching, I would, of course, talk about these modern day, what is modern day public relation, and who are the founders, and how did this career path and profession start. And I also think about my own past, because I've been doing this for a while. And during my time in public relations, I am the person in my high school yearbook who said, I am going to study public relations and work in public relations. I actually said that in my high school yearbook. And then I went to get a degree in public relations at Purdue and a master's degree in public relations at the University of Texas. So, I drink this Kool-Aid. More importantly, I wanted to say that in my lifetime, PR has changed very dramatically. So when I started out my career, we used to type up, not in a typewriter, we actually had computers at the time, but we used to type up press releases, put them in envelopes, fold them up, put them in envelopes, put a stamp on them, and mail out those press releases. I remember when I was working at AT&T, I remember the first fax machines. So the world, we used to use these Bacons, if people know what Bacons is, we used to use these big hardbound Bacons books to find reporters who had already moved on because the publication was printed a year before. And that's how we did our media research. So things have changed so very dramatically. Not only with the onset of the internet, God forbid, that changed everything. And then it continues to change. Social media's onset changed everything. And now AI is about to change things again. And so this evolution is really important. And sometimes I get a little bit overwhelmed and say, oh, I'm old enough, let me retire. But it's so exciting. I got to hang in there because it's so exciting and so many more things are coming. One of my favorite stories about the history of PR and that which I used to teach is stories about, say, the father of public relations. We debate whether that was Edward Bernays or Ivy Lee. And I met Edward Bernays. I was at a Public Relations Society of America conference in Chicago in a certain year, and he was there. And not only was he there, I was at Purdue University at the time, and we were having an event that was called the Boilermaker Open, and it was in our hotel rooms. So we all had hotel rooms sort of adjacent, and we were holding this event. It was a drinking event. And Mr. Bernays walked down the hallway and he came into my hotel room and he sat on my hotel room bed and talked with us. And so here we were, a bunch of college students, and we heard from the master of all masters. And so that was really exciting. That was an exciting bridge between what is now modern day public relations and this kind of kickoff point to future PR. So sort of kind of looking back on something that I just referred to is that Ivy Lee and Edward Bernays have both been criticized for some of their work in the past. And so, for example, Bernays was probably the person who got women to start smoking cigarettes as torches of liberty. And a lot of people look back on that and say he was all about corporate, generating income for the corporation. And Ivy Lee was actually suspected or did work for the Nazi government. And I forget the name of the organization, but something like TD Die or that worked with the Nazi government and supporting them and the Rockefellers and kind of putting down strikes and that kind of thing. So there are not two sides to this coin. There is a huge continuum. There's a huge spectrum. And we can decide as public relations practitioners if we want to work to support an organization's achievement of their quarterly, Wall Street goals, or if we want to do something more with our skills, or if we want to do both, if we want to volunteer to help an organization achieve its mission and its goals that are in line with our values. and do some work for corporate clients who, are making money for their investors. So there's just a lot that we can do with our skills. And I just ask people to, at least when you have some luxury of time, is to apply your skills for good.
I've noticed that people often use those exact same stories about the Nazis or Torches of Liberty to disparage the entire profession of public relations. And they'll just lump it in and they'll say, oh, public relations professionals, they're all like this, because look at the fathers of public relations. And I just want to give you an opportunity to speak to and rebut this jaded notion that we aren't telling the truth well and quickly. Because that's at the heart of public relations, is ethics. Can you speak a little bit about the importance and the place of ethics in our profession?
Yeah, I actually, Ryan, you're putting me down into my rabbit hole. I'm the ethics chair for the Public Relations Society of America chapter here in San Antonio. And honestly, I do it because no one else wants to do it. But not true. But they ask me to do it every year because I'm super passionate about it. And if you find out that your child wants to get into public relations, you should be ecstatic about that, because this is a great career path and you can make a difference in this world. So as way more torches of liberty or working with the Nazi regime, way more examples exist of how public relations practitioners have used our skills to make a positive impact in this world. And I was, just kind of for the fun of it, I was looking up the decline of cancer, and especially lung cancer in this country. And when we public relations practitioners, discovered that cigarette smoking contributes to cancer, lung cancer, and started to take some action on this. So you look at the American Cancer Society and the American Lung Association, those folks have done such amazing things with outreach, using the skills of a public relations practitioner to encourage people to give up smoking and reduce smoking and that kind of thing. In fact, just this morning, I was walking my dog and this woman told me that she had given up smoking like 2 years ago, and her life was just so dramatically better. Shouldn't have taken her until 2 years ago, because we've been talking about this for a while. But those are the skills that we use to help people and help society. And there are just so many examples like that. Look at all the improvements that have happened to the environment, for example. There's ACOG here in San Antonio is doing a campaign about reducing dumping, so toxic waste and that kind of thing, and raising awareness about how inappropriate it is to dump toxic waste that ends up being, going into our waterways and going into possibly into people's drinking water. So let's raise awareness about these things so we change people's behavior for the good. There have been so many examples of those things that we should be able to point to. And
can you define,
in addition to others.
Can you define ACOG for our listeners?
Oh, I'm so sorry. The Alamo Area Council on Governments. But I could tell you many other examples. Here's another one. The City of San Antonio's Office of Sustainability is rolling out a rebate campaign. So what they're doing is they're communicating about the many ways that the federal government will give you rebates or tax incentives to improve the sustainability, if you will, so the efficiency of your house. So you're using less power. So if you buy an e-car, if you put solar panels on your roof, literally if you just weatherize the windows in your house, there are incentives for doing that. So that contributes not only to the good of the individual, because it lowers their costs, their power costs, but to the entire society and the sustenance of our grid and all those kinds of things.
I love this picture, and I have to push back, right? Because that's part of our role, is to find the places to push back. So ROI and the pressure, especially on young professionals, to maybe do some things that are better for ROI than for ethics. And that constant tension of surveillance capitalism, for example, to push people into the direction of profit over people. How do we equip young professionals to fight back in those kinds of clear power disparity situations?
You know what? I think I hate to say that is the harsh reality of our world, but diplomacy and mentoring. So, what do I mean by that? You're right that quarterly profit incentive, that constant drive for more profitability and more revenues. People are getting laid off at profitable organizations to make them even more profitable. We live in a challenging time, but we do constantly have to weigh the ethical challenges and the that passion, that drive for the bottom line. I work with a young person, and I encourage her to talk to me about what frustrates her and what ideas that she has, and then I champion her issues to my senior management. I also, shockingly, am quite the whistleblower myself, and I have actually sacrificed jobs because I did not believe in the way that our management was handling relationships, not only with external but also with internal audiences. So I feel like public relations professionals have to be the conscience of the organization. We have to be the ones who are blowing that whistle and are, raising our hands and bringing attention to the fact that what we're doing is actually not in the best interest of the organization in the long run. If you look at the research, and lots of research has been done showing this, organizations that make a commitment to their communities, organizations that build goodwill, are actually those who are more profitable. So point out those examples, point out those benchmarks, show people examples of organizations that have done the right thing and have benefited from that, and keep fighting the fight. And honestly, if it gets so bad, then leave and join an organization whose values align with yours.
That is such good advice. And how can we elevate Jiminy Cricket to the level of the C-suite? How can we make that conscience of the organization a part of the leadership in places where obviously maybe they haven't evolved as a company yet to include public relations professionals in the C-suite?
Yeah, I have shared this perspective before, but I think, and this is controversial, but I think that there should be a CPRO. There should be a chief public relations officer in every organization. Ever since I've been in PR, we've had this term, a seat at the table. I'm sure you've heard it many times. A seat at the table. How do you get a seat at the table? Which is kind of, I think, what you're asking me right here. And that is to understand the business. So I've suggested this many times to folks who I have worked with, who I have trained, is that your first job is not only to be a good person, but to know the organization. So you need to know how the operations work. You need to know how the marketing department works, how the sales department works, how human resources works. You need to know how every part of your organization works so you can give advice that makes sense from your perspective and from the organizational operation perspective. And that will give you the credibility. We started out by talking about credibility. Your organization needs credibility, and so do you. You need to build credibility for yourself so that when you do raise your hand, the CEO will listen to you because you have given that person good, sage advice in the past that has paid off.
On building credibility, what else can a young person do or someone, a professional do to build that credibility And what are some sources that you recommend for building our PR chops, our PR expertise too?
One of the things that I have recommended to my students about when they're applying for jobs is to kind of be a Swiss Army knife. So have a lot of skills, especially now. When I was first starting out in this career, there might have been one person who did advertising and one person who did direct mail and one person who did PR. And now one person has to do all of those things. So build your skills when you're in college, build your skills when you're soon out of college, so you can do everything. And also be extremely well read. Know what's going on in your community. I am passionate about taking in news, consuming news, and finding out what's happening. So I can then make recommendations based on what's happening in the world and what's happening in my community. You've got to understand what your CEO and all the folks in the C-suite care about. What keeps them up nights? So when we're talking about interviewing, for example, we talk about what are this organization's pain points? Know the organization's pain points, as much as you can, even before you start working at that organization, and then learn them while you're there. And sit down, like shadow someone for a day and reach out to them and say, oh, and here's a good example. We have a young woman who is interning at our office. And you know what she does? She finds articles and she sends them to people who she knows care about particular issues. Brilliant. Because they then come to see that she's a trustworthy person who gets it strategically, who gets it and understands what the challenges that the organization faces and possibly then what the solutions are.
What are some sources that you recommend for students or professionals who are struggling with those core functions of PR, like trying to get things placed in the media, or trying to make sure that they're connecting ROI to what they do and the trust that they're building? What are some resources that can help us accomplish those kinds of goals?
I sound like a shill for the Public Relations Society of America. And in some ways I am, because they're a great resource. And you don't have to be a member of PRSA to tap into some of their resources at prsa.org. But there are many resources there. I also am a big fan of just academia. So if you want to go back to school, take some classes at UTSA, at some of the Alamo colleges, they offer great programs to learn more about it. I mentioned that I'm involvement in PRSA. We're doing what they call a gift of guidance. So we're helping folks learn, build their strategic communication skills. And we do that every year in November. And then, speaking of being a shill, I like a lot of the resources on PBS. So Public Broadcasting Service has a lot of programs that talk about the impact of public relations. So there's a program called Trust Me. It's a documentary that is available on PBS. There's another program that I would recommend just because I watched it and it was very, very powerful. We were talking about the application of our skills for kind of good or evil or anything in between. And there's a series called The Power, had to look it up, The Power of Big Oil. And it talks about how for many years, for decades, oil companies have actually used public relations skills to deny any involvement in the contribution toward climate change, and how effectively they did that. And so I recommend watching it. It's kind of hard for me as a public relations practitioner to say, oh gosh, yeah, we can do that. But kind of let's not. And then another resource I recommend is a gentleman named Andy Goodman. And you can research him online. And he is a storyteller. And I took several classes of his that were presented at a national level, actually. And he talks about constructing stories and using the stories to tell about an organization. And it's a very powerful way of telling stories that create an impact and actually drive interest in your organization and support for it.
What are some of those principles? Obviously, I'm obsessed with storytelling, so now I want to know, like, what are some of the things from that experience that you had that have stuck with you today?
Telling a story about one person, for example, what we did in the exercise is we would come up with a story about one person who was part of the system. So I was working in public health at the time in Africa, and there was a gentleman who was actually a community volunteer, and which is kind of amazing because he had to make a living separately, and then he had to go house to house in his community and check on people and talk about surveying. He would survey them. If there was a new baby in the house, he would write down information about that baby. If there were some older people, he would talk about their changing health patterns, and he would report that information out. So he was a surveyor. And so I told the story about this gentleman in order to tell the story about this organization and the impact it was having on the public health conditions of the people in that community and ultimately in that whole region.
How do we measure success as PR professionals? How do we evaluate that what we've done has had that positive impact that we want?
$60,000 question. It really goes back to objective setting. So when you're doing your planning, whatever the process is that you use, so in the RPIE, in the planning session, the planning section of that, you are setting objectives. And those objectives should be SMART, strategic, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. And so when you get to the end of your campaign or your program, you should be able to look back and see if you've met those objectives. Now, easier said than done, right? If you write very clear, SMART objectives, it is much easier to measure whether or not you've achieved them. But there are different kinds of objectives. In our heart of hearts, public relations professionals should be trained to seek an impact or seek even a return on investment. Many public relations professionals focus on outputs, what we're doing. We're going to send out 100 press releases. We're going to post to social media 25 times. Those are outputs. We should be more focused on outcomes, results from our outputs, and impact. What difference are we making? I'm going to mention our friends in St. Louis who developed the mental well-being program. So what they did was measure going in the state of, by surveying, the state of concern about mental health especially among kids. It was right after COVID or during COVID, about kids and their state of mental well-being. So they implemented the campaign. They did a lot of outreach. They aired a lot of messages. They demonstrated it at community events, that kind of thing. And in the end, they did a post survey to see if anything changed. And it did change. So people were feeling much better about the mental health, not only of their own mental health, but about that, the well-being of the children in their daycare centers and in the schools where the studies were conducted. So that kind of impact is what we're really trying to achieve. Did we make the world better? Did we bring about sales for our organization? Did we drive eyeballs to a television show? Did we bring more people to an event? That kind of thing. So did we have the impact that we meant to have? And that's very important. So sometimes we'll do a campaign and then we'll never do the research, the evaluation to determine whether or not it was a success. Now, if you're in a grant world, a grant-funded world, your grantee is going to require that you show them what impact you made. And that's a good thing, because we should all know if we are being impactful, if we are making a difference in the work that we do. And if we don't, then we need to recalibrate and we need to start that process again, whether we change messages, messengers, reach out to new audiences, that kind of thing. We need to recalibrate and start again.
I'm sure that process has revealed challenges and struggles that were not seen before you did that hard work of evaluation. Can you speak about some of those examples where maybe you were surprised or challenged by something you didn't see before you did that hard work of evaluating?
Yeah, and there are some upsides, I'm sure, and downsides. I think of an example of a program that we implemented last year at KLRN, and it was called City Showdown. And it for every one of the districts in the city of San Antonio, there was a musical performer who, basically volunteered and was connected to that district. And then we did a campaign to raise awareness about, like, this is what's in District 1, and this is the musician who's representing District 1, and here are all the cool, places you can go and things you can do in District 1. And so it was this awareness-raising campaign, and just a lot of fun, because it was, it was a digital program, and it was a blast to do. So we had set certain goals of how many impressions we were going to have, and how many people would vote, because you got to vote. So many, you could vote on the musician that you liked, and how many people were going to vote. Well, we blew those numbers out of the water. We did way better than we had anticipated, and that was a real lesson learned. We also learned that some of the work that we did was way too time consuming. So some of the processes we developed were way too time consuming on staff. And so we needed to figure out a way to do it in subsequent years. We need to figure out a way to kind of dial back those processes. So those are I think, good examples of the pros and the cons in a good evaluation that we learn from and adjust to, and then, do it bigger and better in the future years.
I love that you mentioned the stress on staff and how we might solve those problems, because we've talked about AI before, and I'm thinking, oh, here's an opportunity with an ethical use of an ethically built AI to be able to help to take some of that workload off of staff. Where do you see that going? Where do you see the use of AI in the near term helping public relations professionals?
Yeah, you know what? I don't fancy myself an expert on AI, but I'm so excited about the possibilities of it. Yesterday, there was a PBS annual, they called it an annual meeting, and there were all these different breakout sessions, and one of them was on AI. And so we all see the promise of AI. And as you and I have talked, because you spoke at a PRSA meeting that I was working on as well, we see the pros and we see the cons and the worries. I see this example as an opportunity to tap into ethical uses of AI, and I have fewer concerns about it in this case. But we do every one of us is pressured every day to do more work and to produce more, even in a very positive organization like the one I work for. We all want to do more. We all are driven to do more because we want our organization to succeed.
What sets a public relations professional apart in this climate, in today's industry?
I had mentioned before that you have to be a good listener. And so this is where, we cut the wheat from the chaff. A PR professional who is a good listener and who truly cares about the company or the clients is really going to stand out from the rest. Someone who goes above and beyond the call of duty. Someone who thinks about the organization as if they were their client, even if they are not their client. And I'm thinking about, in our case, if we see a show that is airing on PBS and we know a client who is very aligned to the content of the program, if I reach out to them and tell them that it's airing. For example, I tell all my friends at KRTU when we are airing a show around jazz, and I put their spot around that show. They don't ask me to do that. I just do that because I understand who they are and what their mission is and what their goals are, and I want to help them achieve their mission. So I think a PR professional needs to authentically believe in and be passionate about their own organization's products and services and the products and services of anyone who they serve. I think they also need to be persistent. We talked before about how your senior management might be more concerned about revenues and you might be more concerned about your community. And so the credibility that you build up, as I said before, that credibility helps them hear you when you persistently and diplomatically encourage them to take your advice. You also have to have very thick skin and let things roll off of you. When choose your battles, and stay tough, and then come back and fight that battle again when the time is right.
Can you give us an example of thick skin? What do you mean by that? Like, what would someone say that I would have to have thick skin for if I'm fighting for a cause that I really believe in for my company?
I'm trying to think of an ideal example that wouldn't get anyone in trouble. But I think that when we have good ideas, PR professionals tend to say, oh, listen to this, I have a good idea. And sometimes that idea is not well received, or it's perceived as going against some of the other goals of the organization. Like, oh, that's going to cost too much, or that is going to take too much staff time, that kind of thing. So listen and let that idea sink in to your own, kind of to your own brain, but have thick skin if someone dismisses your idea, and then take time and regroup and circle back. If it's still really a good idea, repitch it and be sure that you have all the evidence on your side as to how it's going to help the organization and be better for the organization than not doing it.
What can you share about crisis communication planning that might help our audience to better prepare for the future and those inevitable crises that our organizations are going to face?
Yeah, there's nothing better than asking an old PR pro to talk about crises. There's so many great stories out there. But I'm going to start out by talking about planning because there is a theme here today. So part of our planning in the research phase as well as in the planning phase should be about worst case scenario planning and in just bad case scenario planning. What is likely to go wrong here and what is the worst case scenario that you can possibly think of? So I always get the most cynical person I know in the organization, get them in that room and let's talk about what could go wrong. And then, obviously several approaches to that, how to prevent it, how to mitigate it, and how to respond to it. And I have taught crisis management and bringing an organization back, trying to bring an organization back from a crisis. Some organizations never come back from very big crises, but some people do. I mean, look at Martha Stewart. There are lots and lots of examples of folks who have managed a crisis effectively and returned, but just as many who are no longer with us. Like, look at Enron. So once you do this kind of strategic approach to planning and considering what all types of crises or bad experiences you could have, then you need to train your staff to prepare for them and respond to them. So, I could give you some examples. And had one of our drivers killed in a homicide, and we had to have a media response for that as well. So a lot of it has to do with building relationships with media in advance so that when you reach out to them and tell them this had nothing to do with our organization, that this is what happened, they will be more likely to listen to you because they trust you and to give the most sanguine reporting on the situation. So that relationship, we always talk about relationship building. It's all about relationship building. So that's one of the cases where that is true. And we also have to know how to get information out very quickly. In this day and age, that is much easier. At that time, it was more complicated. And just to reach out to employees, because that was the number one constituency for us in that case, is to assure employees that we understood what they were going through. A lot of us knew her and cared about her, were friendly with her. So that was an important constituency as well. But planning in advance for a crisis is the most important thing, and trying to head them off at the pass is the most important thing.
I can imagine it. Like that whole idea of working with media to explain what happened in the face of such tragedy, that seems like it's just loaded with pitfalls and places for mistakes. And even with the best plan possible, will that plan survive contact with the real world, right?
Right.
How do you navigate the especially tricky parts there? I know that part of it is developing those relationships beforehand, but what else do people need to really have in the front of their minds whenever something that is a crisis hits that organization? What are the biggest priorities?
Well, the other issue is that media relationships, first of all, media change a lot. And, reporters are one day they're in this job. A friend of mine just was working in Houston and now he's in San Antonio again. Like they change a lot. And I also have an example of a situation in South Africa where we did not have a relationship with the particular reporter who did this kind of expose, what he thought was an expose on a clinical trial that we were holding. It was an HIV clinical trial that we were holding with some young people. And so he thought he was exposing this terrible situation. We didn't have a relationship with him. We didn't know him. So we knew other folks at the paper, but we didn't know him. And so there was a great deal of, sitting down and getting a local spokesperson. I was in New York. We had a local spokesperson who is a member of the community who had been media trained by me. So she was prepared. And that's one of the things to always do, is to have your spokespeople media trained, to educate people, employees, of what their role is. So if someone asks them a question, they refer to the spokesperson, the official spokesperson for the organization. All of that takes training. All of that takes education. And that is nonstop. You need to do that all the time. You need to remind people of that all the time. So those structures need to be in place. And then in the case of South Africa, we had to do a lot more work on the ground to rebuild relationships with that community. Because we spent a lot of time in the community building up the relationships about the need for that clinical trial and the use of that clinical trial in saving people's lives. And then all of a sudden we were accused of doing something that sounded like we compensated the young women who were in the trial. We compensated them as you would to be in a clinical trial. And it made it sound like we were paying them to have sex, young women to have sex and to cut school, to go to their doctor's appointment. So it was a very tricky messaging situation, and we really had to get on the ground quickly and respond.
Wow. Talk about disasters, right?
Yeah.
What a story. I imagine in a situation like that, sometimes people who don't necessarily have the media training are being thrust in front of the camera.
Right.
What are some things that you would tell people who are all of a sudden with cameras and mics in their face and they don't have the media training? But they're going to talk to you right before they go on camera. What are some things that you would tell them to help navigate those treacherous situations?
Yeah, well, like I said, we tried to get the key folks media trained, but you are right. What happens in the real world is that some reporter is going to be in front of that clinic with a microphone and maybe a camera and start asking questions of a clinician who has not gone through the training. So in contemporary times, first of all, we always have our talking points. We always have those, basically available everywhere. So we would have it on a shared server where anyone could bring them down. Anyone in the organization could bring them down no matter what time zone they're in. And that's kind of a different issue if you're working globally versus locally. We would try, of course, to get a spokesperson out on the site, but we would ask that person, if I had 10 minutes to talk to that clinician and give them some guidance, I would go through the essential Crisis Training 101, Media Training 101, and ask them to implement the talking points, to use the talking points, and kind of show empathy, show caring, show sympathy. That's the one area that organizations, companies especially, they don't show sufficient sympathy or empathy to the folks that they work with, and to remind people we're doing this to save lives.
What would be one key piece of advice if you had to give that advice to a young person, a young professional, somebody who is starting out in PR, or what kind of one core action should that person take to set them up for success in this field?
I guess I would say one piece of advice, as if, Ryan, you know me now, one piece of advice. I think it's listen and learn. And what I would say is make sure you know everything you can about your organization. Interview and shadow your leaders and your colleagues. Make sure you know what everyone does in that organization, how everything works, what's the functioning of every department. Know people's challenges and know what their expertise is, and know how you can help them and they can help you. I always recommend doing a SWOT. Do a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. Know not only your organization, but know your competition or your opponents. And be relentlessly curious. Maybe that's what my main advice would be. Be relentlessly curious. Write everything down and file it well. I can't tell you the many times that I have not written things down. And then I'm like, what was that I learned that I really need to know right now? Write it all down. And take time, like I keep talking about. Take time to plan, to strategize, and just to think.
I love the words relentless curiosity. That is a North Star, isn't it?
It really is.
Thank you so much again for joining us and for sharing your expertise. Where can people find you online if they wanted to contact you or reach out to you?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn for sure. And I'm not even sure exactly how to get me there, but I'm on LinkedIn, so you can find me. I'm in San Antonio, Melissa May, MA APR. And I'm on Facebook, but I don't do too much on Facebook. And you can mostly find me at KLRN. So it's MMAY at KLRN.org. Come visit us at KLRN.org.
Awesome. Thank you again, Melissa. We have so appreciated the advice, the experience, and the stories that you've shared with us today.
Thank you, Ryan. It's been really fun.